September 1944. General George S. Patton's Third Army was racing across France, pursuing a broken German Wehrmacht toward their homeland. But in one ancient French town, the local mayor stood firm, defiantly blocking Patton's tanks from entering, threatening to derail the entire Allied advance. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant gunpowder, as the forward elements of Patton's renowned Third Army, a force synonymous with speed and ruthless efficiency, ground to an unexpected halt. Dust-caked half-tracks and formidable Sherman tanks, their tracks still caked with the mud of 100 liberated villages, idled in the late summer sun. Their engines, usually snarling with kinetic energy, now coughed and rumbled in a symphony of frustrated power. The men, hardened by relentless combat, peered out from beneath their helmets, a mixture of bewilderment and exasperation etched on their faces.
They had faced down Hitler's finest, crushed panzer divisions, and liberated swaths of French territory. They had pushed the enemy relentlessly, turning retreat into rout. But here, on the outskirts of an anonymous French commune, their momentum was suddenly, incomprehensibly broken. Not by machine gun fire, not by hidden minefields, not by a desperate German counterattack. No, this shocking impediment came not from the battlefield, but from the town itself. Standing directly in the path of the lead tank, a lone figure in civilian attire. A trim man, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his silver hair carefully combed, his face a mask of determined civility. This was not a German officer, nor a partisan operative. This was the mayor of the town, his posture erect, his gaze unwavering, and his hands conspicuously empty. A strange, surreal tableau unfolded. The blunt, overwhelming force of war, brought to a standstill by the sheer will of a bureaucrat. A chorus of angry shouts erupted from the American ranks, bewildered and frustrated by this absurd, almost comical turn of events. Officers, their voices strained with disbelief, tried to communicate, to reason, to intimidate, but the mayor remained unmoved, a stubborn, unyielding rock against the tide of mechanized warfare. The irony was palpable, almost cruel. They had overcome every military obstacle, every fortified line, every desperate defense. Now their advance stalled, not by bullets and bombs, but by a quiet, defiant man and a municipal decree. It was an affront to their speed, a challenge to their authority, and a bewildering interruption to their vital mission. The entire war effort, the relentless push to victory, hung precariously on this single, unexpected confrontation. For General George S. Patton, delay was anathema. It was a poison to his very soul, a betrayal of everything he stood for. His Third Army, a coil spring of mechanized fury, had been unleashed across France like a hurricane. In just a few searing weeks of August 1944, they had torn through Brittany, liberated Paris, and were now plunging eastward towards the Rhine. This wasn't merely an advance, it was a phenomenon, what some called an Allied blitzkrieg, a relentless 72-day assault that saw Patton's forces average over 40 kilometers a day, covering more ground than any other Allied army in the same time frame. This wasn't just speed, it was a military doctrine given flesh, a living, breathing testament to the power of relentless forward momentum. Patton, a man of aggressive action and unshakable conviction, had famously declared, not once, but repeatedly, that he would rather lead a column of troops than be stopped by a single man.
His entire career was built on the premise of rapid maneuver, of catching the enemy off balance, of exploiting every crack in their defences with a ferocity that bordered on gleeful. He lived by the maxim that time was the ultimate weapon, and any moment lost was a victory surrendered. His tanks, his infantry, his entire logistical network were finely tuned instruments designed for one purpose: to move, to strike, to overwhelm. From the dust-choked roads of Normandy to the shattered towns of the French heartland, the thunder of his engines, the roar of his cannons, and the sheer audacity of his attacks had become the soundtrack of liberation. His soldiers, seasoned and hardened, had internalized this ethos. They had fought their way through hedgerow country, circumvented German strongpoints, driven back panzer divisions. They expected to encounter hardened resistance, cunning ambushes, desperate fortifications. They were prepared for anything the Wehrmacht could throw at them. But now, here, in this seemingly insignificant French village, the juggernaut was halted. Not by battle, not by barricades, not by the formidable steel and fire of the enemy, but by the stubborn, almost absurd defiance of a single, impeccably dressed civilian, a mayor, a man armed with nothing but bureaucratic obstinacy and a seemingly impenetrable legalistic shield. The outrage among the American troops was palpable, a low growl that threatened to erupt into something far more dangerous. They were soldiers, not diplomats. Their mission was clear: push forward. Every tick of the clock, every gallon of gasoline consumed while standing still was a drain on their resources, a betrayal of the momentum that had carried them so far. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an insult to their training, a direct challenge to their hard-won victories, and a confounding derailment of their relentless march towards the heart of the Third Reich. The specter of a stalled advance, a loss of the precious momentum that had propelled them across France, was a nightmare that even the bravest among them feared. The war hung in the balance, and a French mayor, with his quiet dignity and unyielding stance, had somehow, incredibly, managed to bring it all to a screeching halt. This mayor, Monsieur Bernard, was no ordinary bureaucrat, nor was his town simply another dot on a tactical map. Verdun, a name etched deep into the collective memory of France, a city whose very stones whispered tales of unimaginable sacrifice and unyielding defiance. A place where barely 3 decades prior, the blood of hundreds of thousands had soaked the earth, making it hallowed ground, a testament to the nation's unwavering spirit. Monsieur Bernard, a man of 50-odd years, with silvering temples and eyes that held the quiet dignity of one who had witnessed much, understood this profoundly. He had lived through the First Great War, had seen Verdun scarred, then rebuilt, meticulously, lovingly, stone by agonizing stone. This wasn't merely a collection of buildings. It was a living monument, a repository of history and national identity. Its ancient cathedral, a soaring Gothic masterpiece, stood as a beacon of faith and endurance. Its cobbled streets, winding and narrow, bore the imprints of centuries of footsteps. Every archway, every fresco, every centuries-old dwelling was a piece of France itself. To Monsieur Bernard, the roar of American tanks, the grinding treads threatening to fracture ancient paving stones, the sheer weight of mechanized warfare poised to tear through the delicate fabric of his city, was an assault on something far more precious than mere infrastructure. It was an affront to memory, a desecration of the sacred.
He saw not just a military convoy, but a destructive force that, however well-intentioned, placed the immediate imperative of military logistics above the irreplaceable spiritual and historical heritage of his people. He was a man of his region, fiercely proud of its resilience, its beauty, its hard-won peace. For years, he had presided over the painstaking resurrection of Verdun, guiding its recovery from the ravages of the previous war. His constituents, his neighbors, the families he knew intimately, had poured their hearts and souls, their meager resources into restoring their homes, their shops, their lives. Now, on the cusp of liberation, after years of grinding occupation, they faced a new threat, albeit from an ally. It was an unbearable irony. His motivations were not simple obstructionism, nor a lack of gratitude for the liberating forces. Far from it. Monsieur Bernard understood the strategic importance of the advance, the urgency of pushing the Germans back. But he also carried the weight of history on his shoulders, the solemn duty to protect his community, not just from the visible enemy, but from the collateral damage of even friendly fire. He acted not out of malice, but from a profound ancestral love for his homeland, a desperate, almost defiant devotion to preserving the irreplaceable. He stood as a bulwark, a solitary figure against the tide of war, driven by a quiet, unshakable conviction that some things, some places, were simply too precious to sacrifice, even for victory. He would not allow Verdun to be another casualty of war, not on his watch, not if he could stand in the way. He would protect his town, come what may, even from the overwhelming might of General Patton's Third Army. The lead elements of Patton's 11th Armored Division, spearheaded by the reconnaissance squadrons, ground to a halt. Not at a German strongpoint, not at a minefield, but before a hastily erected barricade of ancient farm carts and refuse, manned by a determined, if bewildered, civilian populace. Sergeant Johnson of the 81st Reconnaissance Battalion, a battle-hardened veteran of North Africa and Sicily, dismounted his jeep, weapon at the ready, and began to speak, his serviceable but heavily accented French a stark contrast to the mayor's clipped, indignant tones. Monsieur le Maire, Johnson began, his voice strained but polite. We are the American Third Army. We are here to liberate France, to drive the Germans out. He gestured vaguely beyond the town, towards the front lines, the rumble of artillery, a distant, constant reminder of the ongoing conflict. Our tanks, they must pass. We have orders to advance, to strike at the enemy. Time is critical. Bernard, a man whose face bore the etched lines of decades spent navigating the political nuances of municipal governance, listened with a patience bordering on outright defiance. He understood the words, but not the implication, not the wholesale devastation that rapid passage with heavy armor would wreak upon his beloved town. His response was immediate, resolute, and unwavering. Sergeant, I understand your mission. I appreciate your intentions. But Verdun has suffered enough. We cannot allow these machines to pass through our streets. Not until we can guarantee the safety of our people, the preservation of our homes. Our children are still in the cellars. Our wounded are in the church. Our recovery has just begun. The exchange, initially civil, devolved quickly into a frustrating standoff. Message after message was relayed back to the spearhead's command post, then up the chain to division headquarters. Mayor of Verdun blocking advance, citing civilian casualties, structural damage, refusing to yield. Each report fueled the growing incredulity among Patton's staff. What in God's name is happening down there? Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 11th Armored, barked into his field telephone, his patience wearing thin. Are they not liberated? Do they not understand the urgency? The irony was not lost on the men of the Third Army. They had fought their way across France, liberating town after town, often to rapturous welcomes. The grateful smiles, the flowers, the wine, these were the expected emblems of their advance. Now, faced with outright obstruction from a seemingly liberated populace, a palpable anger began to simmer. These frogs, a tank gunner muttered, his voice laced with venom. They want to be free, but they won't let us make them free. The sentiment was echoed across the lines. Confusion, frustration, and a sense of betrayal. Could these people truly not comprehend the larger stakes? The Germans were regrouping, digging in. Every hour lost here meant more American lives spent later, fighting through fortified positions. The clock was ticking, and General Patton, never one for patience, was about to be informed of this inexplicable delay. An American army on the cusp of a decisive breakthrough, held hostage by a small-town mayor. The absurdity was almost unbearable. And then the news reached Patton. The explosion was immediate, volcanic. His office, a hastily requisitioned chateau or portable tent at the front, would invariably witness the storm. Curses, raw and guttural, lacerated the air, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of his riding crop against his polished boots, or, more ominously, against a map table. Maps, usually treated with near religious reverence, might be swept aside in a paroxysm of rage. What in God's name is happening, he roared, the question less a query and more an indictment of the universe itself. His aides, hardened by countless such outbursts, braced themselves for the inevitable onslaught, their faces impassive, but their minds racing to formulate plausible explanations, any explanation that might calm the tempest. Patton saw red. A mayor, a goddamn mayor, holding up the Third Army. It was an insult, a direct affront not just to his command, but to the very concept of military progress. He paced like a caged tiger, his brain churning, each stride a visual representation of the urgency he felt. This wasn't merely a delay, it was a hemorrhage of time, a strategic wound that could prove fatal. The momentum, that fragile, volatile force that powered deep penetrations and shattered enemy lines, was being squandered. He lived and breathed momentum. He preached its gospel to every tank commander, every infantry squad leader. When momentum was lost, the war became a brutal, grinding slog. And that, he knew, meant more body bags, more shattered families back home. Eisenhower, ever the strategist, had hammered home the critical importance of speed. The entire Allied timetable was predicated on rapid advances. Supply lines were stretched to their breaking point, but the strategic imperative was absolute. Keep hitting the Germans. Keep them off balance. Don't give them a moment to breathe, to dig in, to rebuild their shattered divisions. Every hour the Third Army stood idle, every single minute, allowed the Wehrmacht precious time. Time to reinforce their positions. Time to establish new defensive lines. Time to consolidate. A bottleneck in a seemingly insignificant French town could have catastrophic ripple effects across the entire Western Front. The grand strategy, meticulously crafted on war room maps by Eisenhower and his generals, relied on each army playing its part, maintaining its pace. A single cog in the massive war machine seizing up could throw the entire mechanism into disarray.
Patton understood this with brutal clarity. His mission wasn't just to liberate towns. It was to destroy the German war machine. To do that, he needed to move. He needed to advance. He needed to strike. And now, a paltry obstacle, a civil servant more concerned with local ordinances than global war, stood in his way. The implications were staggering. If the Third Army faltered here, other units further north or south might find their flanks exposed, their supply routes vulnerable. The delicate orchestration of the Allied invasion, the painstaking planning of D-Day and the subsequent pursuit across France, all of it could be jeopardized by this single act of monumental foolishness. His jaw clenched, a muscle pulsing in his temple. This would not stand. Not on his watch. His engineers, those unsung heroes of rapid advance, were already at work. Bridge demolition was the enemy's signature tune, a disruptive symphony played on every river crossing.
From the Meuse to the Moselle, countless spans lay twisted monuments of steel and concrete, their skeletal remains a testament to German retreat tactics. Patton's bridge-building battalions, often working under incessant shell fire, had become masters of their craft, throwing up temporary structures with astonishing speed. But even these virtuosos of expediency had their limits. Reconnaissance units, jeeps splashing through muddy tracks, pilots banking dangerously low in their Piper Cubs, scouted relentlessly. Their reports painted a grim picture, a labyrinth of cratered roads and impassable fields. Every detour meant precious hours, every destroyed bridge a logistical nightmare. The terrain, already unforgiving, had been made more so by the scars of war. Farm tracks, never designed for the weight of Sherman tanks, dissolved into quagmires after a few heavy vehicles passed. Narrow country lanes, choked with debris and the wrecks of earlier skirmishes, offered no real alternative. The engineers, sweat-soaked and begrimed, battled nature and the enemy's demolition squads. They laid down corduroy roads over soft ground, cut new paths through dense woods with chainsaws and explosives, and built hasty pontoon bridges. But each such effort was a deviation, an expenditure of time and resources that drained the momentum from the advance. Fuel consumption soared on rutted tracks. Vehicle wear and tear escalated, and the meticulously planned supply lines stretched to their breaking point. Intelligence reports confirmed it. The mayor's town, for all its provincial charm and inconvenient civic pride, was the fastest, most logical path. Its main thoroughfare was sufficiently wide, its bridges still largely intact. It was the natural funnel point, the arterial route that offered the clearest shot through to the German lines. Every other option, every twisting, turning bypass added miles, consumed fuel, and most critically, ate away at the most precious commodity of all, time. Patton saw the battlefield as a chessboard, and every delay, every obstruction, whether natural or man-made, was a piece lost, a move squandered. The Germans, though reeling, were not broken. They were digging in, forming desperate pockets of resistance and retreating to their Siegfried line, the formidable West Wall. Every hour Patton's tanks were held back by a local bureaucrat was an hour the Wehrmacht gained, an hour they used to reinforce, to rearm, to regroup. This was not merely about traversing a town. It was about the very tempo of the war. It was about preventing a stalemate, about maintaining the relentless, crushing pressure that was slowly but surely forcing Germany to its knees. The stakes were far too high for diplomatic niceties. And so the reports flooded back to Patton's command post. Mayor Pickett of Auden-le-Tiche was holding up the advance, a civilian leader clinging to what he surely saw as sovereign authority, blocking
the inexorable tide of American armour. For a man of Patton's temperament, whose entire philosophy of warfare was built on rapid movement, on seizing the initiative, on continuous assault, this was not just an inconvenience, it was an insult, a direct challenge, and it was intolerable. The general himself, George S. Patton Jr., a figure as legendary as he was controversial, received the news with a chilling calm that betrayed the fury simmering beneath. He was a man forged in the crucible of battle, his uniform often bearing the dust and grime of the front lines. His pearl-handled revolvers, his trademark, were not mere ornamentation, but a statement. He was a warrior through and through.
He didn't send subordinates to deal with recalcitrant village officials when the very thrust of his army was at stake. He went himself. The drive to Odin-Latish was not long, but the tension in the general's staff car was palpable. His aides knew better than to speak, to even breathe too loudly. They understood the general's mood, a dangerous stillness before the storm. When they arrived, the contrast could not have been starker. On one side, the war machine embodied, Patton, resplendent even in his dust-caked uniform, his steel helmet like a promise of retribution, the very air around him thick with combat. Behind him, the rumbling threat of his tanks, their monstrous treads chewing at the earth, their long guns pointed implicitly towards the town. On the other, Mayor Paquette, a man of civic order, undoubtedly well-meaning, concerned for his town and its people, perhaps even emboldened by his perceived legal standing. He likely saw himself as a guardian, a bulwark against chaos. What he likely didn't see, or couldn't comprehend, was the utter cosmic insignificance of his municipal bylaws when confronted with a general driven by the imperative to win a global war. The confrontation took place, as these things often do, in a makeshift office, perhaps the mayor's own, still reeking faintly of dusty ledgers and stale pipe smoke. The air, already thick, grew heavier as Patton entered. The general filled the room, not just with his physical presence, but with the sheer force of his personality. His gaze, famously intense, fixed on the mayor, who, by most accounts, stood his ground with a surprising degree of fortitude. One can only imagine the scene. Patton, a titan of war, standing before a civilian official who asserted local rights over the exigencies of a world conflict. The mayor, perhaps gesturing wildly, explaining local statutes, the damage to infrastructure, the welfare of his townsfolk. Patton, a man of few words when his temper brewed, likely listened with an impatience barely contained. His jaw would have been set, his eyes unblinking chips of ice, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. This was not a negotiation. This was a direct challenge to his authority, to his mission, to the very concept of military necessity. The power dynamic vibrated in the room, threatening to shatter the fragile peace. The stakes, to Patton, were clear. Either the mayor stepped aside, or he would be swept aside. The war would not wait for a local election or a town council meeting. The war, for better or worse, was now in Odin-Latish. "You will move your tanks," Patton thundered, a statement, not a request. His voice, accustomed to commanding legions, resonated with an authority that left no room for dissent. The air crackled with the raw assertion of military power. This was the voice that had driven the Third Army across France like a scythe through wheat.
the voice that had inspired courage and struck terror. But Mayor Jules Maillot, a man forged in the quiet resilience of rural France, stood firm. His response was delivered with a quiet dignity, a stark contrast to Patton's volcanic intensity. General, with all due respect, my town is not a thoroughfare for your machines of war. Our roads are not built for such burdens. Our infrastructure cannot withstand it. My people are weary. There was no defiance in his tone, no theatricality. It was simply the unshakable conviction of a man protecting his own. Patton, a general who measured time in miles conquered and enemies routed, was unaccustomed to such resistance. His eyebrows, thick and grey, furrowed in a gaze that could wither lesser men. He lightly leaned closer, his imposing frame dominating the small office, the scent of leather and gunpowder clinging to his uniform.
We are fighting a war, Monsieur le Maire, a war that threatens not just France, but the very soul of the civilized world. Do you understand the urgency? Do you comprehend the consequences of delay? His words were designed to overwhelm, to make the mayor feel the weight of history on his shoulders, the enormity of the conflict crashing down upon his small town. Yet Maillot remained unbowed. His gaze, though less piercing than Patton's, held an unwavering resolve. I understand the war, General. I have lived through its horrors. But I also understand my duty to my constituents. To destroy what little we have left, to render our homes uninhabitable, to jeopardize the lives of my townsfolk for a single shortcut. That, General, I cannot do. He spoke not as a man confronting a general, but as a guardian confronting a force of nature, protecting his flock from an impending storm. It was a psychological battle. Two immovable objects, one driven by the relentless current of war, the other anchored by the deep roots of a community. The room was thick with the silent struggle, the clash of wills, far more potent than any shouted command. Patton, a man who saw obstacles as challenges to be brutally overcome, was faced with an unexpected, profoundly human barrier. Patton, a general whose reputation was forged in fire and steel, found himself facing a defiance more formidable than any fortified bunker. It wasn't the roar of enemy artillery that stymied him, but the quiet, dignified stand of a man committed to his people. He was accustomed to breaking lines, not negotiating with civilians. Yet, the usual bluster and threats, the very essence of his command presence, seemed to bounce off Maillot like bullets off a tank's reinforced plate. The silence in the room stretched, taut as a violin string about to snap. The air thrummed with a tension that surpassed the battlefield itself. A lesser man might have resorted to force, to simply order his tanks to roll, consequences be damned. But Patton, for all his perceived ruthlessness, was not entirely devoid of nuanced thought. He understood the optics, the morale implications not just for the French, but for American troops witnessing such an act. He needed the local populace on his side, or at least not actively against him. To crush this mayor's will without consideration risked turning a tactical inconvenience into a strategic blunder. This was the moment of decision, a crossroads where Patton's famed impulsiveness could either lead to triumph or disaster. He paced, one hand massaging his jaw, his eyes sweeping over the mayor, the map, the faces of his staff. Each stride was a calculation, every twitch of his mustache a processing of variables. Then, a flicker in his eyes, a glint that was less anger and more amusement. A faint smile, almost imperceptible, touched the corners of his mouth. It was the smile of a predator cornering its prey, not through brute force, but through cunning. He stopped, facing Mayo directly, his posture still radiating authority, but now infused with a disarming lack of aggression. The tension in the room, though not entirely dissipated, shifted, altering its very nature. It became less about confrontation and more about anticipation. Mayor, Patton began, his voice lower now, almost conversational, losing its previous roar, but gaining a new, more dangerous edge of controlled intensity. I admire your conviction, truly. A man who stands for his people, even against the tide of war, is a rare commodity. He paused, letting the unexpected compliment hang in the air, a smokescreen of civility. This was a man who understood the theatricality of command, the psychological warfare that went beyond bullets and bombs. However, he continued, the word delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The war, as you know, does not wait for sentiment. My tanks, my men, they must pass. The fate of liberation, Mayor, hinges on this road. Mayo listened, his expression guarded. He had faced down threats, but this subtle shift, this almost respectful acknowledgement, was disorienting. He braced himself for the inevitable ultimatum, the softening of rhetoric followed by the iron fist. But Patton, ever the unpredictable showman, had something else in mind entirely. I give you my word, Mayor, Patton declared, his voice ringing with a new kind of authority, one that sought not to crush, but to circumvent. Not one civilian will be harmed. Not one building will be damaged beyond repair. My engineers, the finest in the Allied forces, will construct a temporary bridge, a bypass around your town center. It will be built with salvaged materials, with the utmost speed and efficiency. They will work day and night without rest until it is complete. He gestured broadly, as if conjuring the phantom span into existence before their very eyes. Your homes, your businesses, your precious church, untouched. My tanks will roll, but they will not touch your streets. The announcement hung in the air, a shocking pronouncement in a conflict defined by destruction. It was an extravagant, almost theatrical solution, a direct challenge to conventional military wisdom. Why spend precious resources, time, and manpower on a detour when the direct route was available? Because Patton, in that moment, understood something deeper than logistics. He understood human nature. He understood that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by conquest, but by compromise, by outmaneuvering not just the enemy, but the very circumstances of the battle. He was offering a lifeline, a face-saving measure for the mayor, a way to uphold his duty while still allowing the war machine to advance. It was an audacious gambit, a stroke of genius that transformed a stalemate into a strategic advantage, echoing the unpredictable nature that defined America's most flamboyant general. The order, when it rippled down the chain of command, was met with a stunned silence. Construction of a bridge? To bypass a small town? During a furious armoured thrust? It felt like something out of a play, a theatrical flourish entirely unsuited to the mud and blood of war. Junior officers scratched their heads.
their maps spread out in the flickering lamplight of their mobile command posts, struggling to reconcile the audacity of the directive with the hard-nosed realities of logistics. Engineers, usually accustomed to building pontoons under fire or repairing shattered infrastructure, were suddenly tasked with an entirely different kind of challenge.
But this was Patton, his reputation preceding him, a force of nature whose commands, however outlandish, were to be obeyed without question. The initial shock quickly gave way to the ingrained discipline of the American fighting man. Confusion curdled into a grim determination. Within hours, the site became a hive of frenetic activity. Scarcely pausing for breath, Army engineers, veterans of countless campaigns, swarmed the designated ground, their heavy equipment rumbling into position. Cranes, their booms stark against the pre-dawn sky, began hoisting massive steel girders. Bulldozers, roaring like primeval beasts, carved away earth with astonishing speed. The air thrummed with the clang of metal upon metal, the sharp, acrid scent of acetylene torches, and the shouts of foremen guiding their teams through the organized chaos. Sleep was a luxury, a distant memory. Soldiers, stripped to their undershirts despite the chill, toiled under powerful floodlights, their faces grimed of dirt and sweat. They worked with an almost superhuman intensity, fueled by coffee, short rations, and the sheer, unyielding will to execute the impossible. Every rivet driven, every plank laid was a testament to their unwavering commitment. The bridge began to take shape, a skeletal form stretching defiantly across the landscape, a temporary monument to an improbable command. Down in Saint-Mer, the mayor, Monsieur Dubois, watched the spectacle unfold from his office window. His initial reaction was a bewildered disbelief that slowly morphed into grudging respect. He had anticipated a confrontation, perhaps an angry exchange, or even the terrifying rumble of tanks simply ignoring his pleas and crushing through his village. Instead, he was witnessing an engineering marvel, a testament to American industrial might and strategic ingenuity, all to honor a promise, to sidestep a small municipality that, in the grand scheme of the war, was utterly insignificant. He had stood firm, protected his town, and in return, the American general, in his outlandish, magnificent way, had honored his position, his people. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his lips. It wasn't an admission of defeat, but rather an acknowledgement of a formidable and surprisingly honourable opponent. The roar of the machinery, the glint of steel, and the endless stream of trucks carrying materials no longer sounded like an invasion, but like a peculiar, albeit formidable, act of respect. It was a moment of profound, almost ironic understanding in the midst of conflict. The detour, initially an audacious gamble, proved a masterstroke. Within 72 hours, the Third Army, instead of being mired in a costly, attritional battle for Sainte-Marie, was once again a spearhead, a thundering phalanx of steel and men carving a path through the French countryside. The improvised bypass, a ribbon of crushed stone and hastily laid bridges, stretched for miles, a testament to American resourcefulness. It had not merely circumnavigated an obstacle, it had outmaneuvered it, turning a potential choke point into a conduit of unstoppable force. The rumble had returned, not as a distant threat, but as a palpable vibration through the very earth, signifying progress, relentless and unforgiving. Trucks, tanks, and half-tracks, once again in full flow, poured through the newly constructed arteries. The roar of thousands of engines merged into a single, overwhelming symphony of logistical power.
Dust plumes rose hundreds of feet into the air, visible for miles, marking the unceasing advance like a moving finger across a vast map.
The air hummed with the energy of men driven by a single, overriding purpose: forward. The aroma of diesel fuel, hot engine oil, and the sweat of determined soldiers mingled with the lingering scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke, a visceral tapestry of war on the move. This was not just an advance, it was a surge. The momentum, so crucial to Patton's doctrine of shock and awe, had been not merely recaptured, but amplified. The division commanders, initially wary of the proposed bypass, now witnessed its effectiveness firsthand. Supply lines, though stretched, remained miraculously intact, feeding the ravenous maw of the advancing army. Fuel convoys, often the Achilles heel of rapid maneuvers, found their cadence, their rhythmic journeys forward providing the lifeblood for the armored thrusts. The strategic importance of this particular leg of the advance cannot be overstated.
By maintaining its blistering pace and avoiding a direct engagement within Saint-Mer, Patton's Third Army kept the German forces reeling, denying them the crucial time needed to establish fortified defensive lines. Every mile gained without significant resistance was a mile closer to their ultimate objectives, a psychological blow to the enemy, and a crucial step towards the liberation of France. The narrow window of opportunity, forged by the success of the Normandy landings, was being exploited with ruthless efficiency. The bypass was more than a road. It was a statement, a declaration that no obstacle, however entrenched or seemingly insurmountable, would halt the inexorable march of a determined army. It was a promise made and kept, not just to a mayor, but to the very concept of strategic agility in the crucible of total war. The Third Army was back to its terrifying, unstoppable self, a juggernaut unleashed. Yet the whispers and the memory of that day, the day General Patton bypassed Saint-Mer, did not fade easily. In the heart of that small French town, the incident etched itself into the local folklore, becoming a recurring motif in conversations passed down through generations. For some, particularly the older village elders who remembered the harsh boot of occupation and the anxiety of waiting for liberation, Patton's decisive, almost brutal efficiency was a cause for quiet admiration. They saw it as the action of a man driven by purpose, unwilling to let anything, not even local bureaucracy, impede the wider war effort. His reputation for being an unyielding, even fearsome commander was not diminished. Rather, it was solidified and, in a strange way, understood. He was the American warrior, a force of nature, and his detour around their town was just another testament to his singular focus. The anecdote became a staple, shared over cafe tables and during evening strolls along the cobbled streets. "Ah, Patton," someone might murmur, a wry smile playing on their lips. "He didn't wait for anyone, did he?" It was a story told with a mixture of awe and a certain almost affectionate exasperation. The initial shock and bewilderment of the mayor and the townsfolk, suddenly finding themselves observing the war from a slight distance as the roaring metal beasts thundered past their perimeter, gradually transformed into a unique point of pride. They hadn't been directly involved in a street battle. Their homes were spared the direct impact of tank treads and artillery barrages. This was, in its own way, a blessing, even if delivered with General Patton's signature blunt force. The incident, far from softening his image, merely added another layer to the complex tapestry of his legend.
It reinforced the idea of Patton as an unpredictable genius, a commander who operated outside the conventional box, a man who saw the bigger picture with unwavering clarity. He wasn't just a general, he was a phenomenon. His actions in St. Mare became a micro-history within the larger narrative of World War II, a vignette illustrating the clash of personalities, the relentless pressure of war, and the often unconventional methods required to achieve victory. It highlighted his distinct persona, a man of action, unburdened by niceties when the stakes were so incredibly high. The townspeople, though initially affronted, eventually recognized the strategic brilliance, however callous, of his decision. They learned of the fighting that raged just miles away, the fierce resistance encountered by other Allied units, and understood that Patton's impatience had, inadvertently, spared them.
The memory, therefore, was not one of resentment, but of a grudging respect for a commander who prioritized the objective above all else, even if it meant ruffling a few feathers, or, in this case, completely bypassing an entire town and its bewildered leader. The tale of the bypassed town became another brushstroke in the portrait of George S. Patton, a general as complex and controversial as he was undeniably effective. It cemented his place not just in military history, but in the enduring memory of a small French community that once stood, quite literally, in the path of destiny. This particular incident, however, highlights more than just Patton's penchant for decisive action. It offers a crucial insight into his multifaceted leadership. He was not merely a blunt instrument of war, a general defined solely by aggression and audacious breakthroughs.
Beneath the gruff exterior, the pearl-handled revolvers, and the stern pronouncements, lay a keen strategic mind, one that understood not only the topography of battlefields, but also the subtle contours of human psychology. Consider the meticulous planning involved in rerouting an entire armored division, a logistical nightmare requiring swift communication and impeccable coordination. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst of rage. It was a calculated maneuver, a demonstration of his profound understanding of operational art. He grasped that in war, momentum is everything. A stalled advance, even for a seemingly trivial reason like a recalcitrant mayor, could have cascading negative effects, losing the element of surprise, allowing the enemy to reinforce, demoralizing his own troops. His solution, though unconventional, was strategically sound, a testament to his ability to think several moves ahead. But beyond the pure military calculus, this episode showcases Patton's surprising grasp of persuasion, even with non-combatants. He understood that a direct confrontation, a forceful removal of the mayor, would have created a lasting resentment, a potentially hostile local population, and an unnecessary diversion of resources. Instead, by a stroke of bold, almost theatrical defiance, he bypassed the problem entirely, leaving the mayor to contend with the stark reality of his irrelevance in the face of an advancing army. This was a psychological maneuver, a way of asserting dominance without firing a shot, proving that his will and the imperative of the war effort superseded all local objections. He didn't need to defeat the mayor, he merely needed to render him impotent. This adaptability, this willingness to operate outside the traditional playbook, was a hallmark of Patton's genius. He could be a ruthless disciplinarian, a brilliant tactician, and, as this story reveals, an astute psychologist. He recognized that leadership, especially in the maelstrom of war, demanded more than just tactical acumen. It required an understanding of people, of their motivations, their fears, and their stubbornness. He understood that sometimes the most effective way to overcome an obstacle was not to confront it head-on, but to simply flow around it,
like a relentless river seeking its course to the sea. The mayor, for all his bluster, was ultimately just a stone in that river, and Patton, with characteristic ingenuity, simply diverted the current. It wasn't about being overtly cruel, it was about being relentlessly effective. And in the crucible of World War II, effectiveness, above all else, was the ultimate measure of command.
This incident, therefore, elevates Patton beyond the caricature of the hot-headed general, revealing a commander of profound strategic depth and psychological insight, capable of both brute force and subtle manipulation in pursuit of victory. This obscure episode, often overlooked in the grand chronicles of the war, crystallizes a vital truth. Warfare is not exclusively fought on the bloodied fields of battle. It stretches into the quiet halls of diplomacy, the fraught negotiations between officers and local officials, the countless skirmishes of will and protocol. This single, seemingly trivial incident in a nameless French town, a brief standoff between an ambitious American general and a stubborn French mayor, illuminates the multifaceted challenges that commanders face daily. It highlights the constant pressure, the complex web of military objectives, political sensitivities, and human eccentricities that could derail even the most meticulously planned operations.
Patton, as always, was an anomaly. His actions, from his fiery speeches to his calculated risks, perpetually confounded both his adversaries and his own command. General Eisenhower, his superior, often found himself grappling with Patton's unpredictable genius, a force of nature that was both indispensable and utterly exasperating. This incident, with its blend of strategic imperative and almost farcical diplomatic maneuvering, serves as another testament to Patton's unconventional nature. He defied categorization, a tactical chameleon capable of adapting to any obstacle, be it heavily fortified enemy lines or an uncooperative municipal leader. He didn't just fight wars, he reimagined their boundaries. He understood that victory often hinged not just on superior firepower or brilliant maneuvers, but on the sheer, unyielding force of personality, on the ability to bend situations to his will, regardless of the rule book. In this instance, he eschewed the traditional military response, opting instead for a psychological gambit, a subtle display of power that left the mayor no viable option but to concede. It wasn't about bullets, it was about ballots, in a way, or at least the unspoken ballots of authority. The war's greatest leaders understood that the battles raged on many fronts: the physical, the logistical, the psychological. And in this small, forgotten town, Patton demonstrated his mastery of all three, turning a potential diplomatic quagmire into a swift, decisive victory of will. This was not a clash of arms, but a silent, tense negotiation of intent, where the stakes were not lives, but time. And in the relentless march across France, time was a commodity more precious than gold.
This incident, therefore, is more than just an anecdote. It's a microcosm of the larger struggle, a testament to the fact that even in the most chaotic and violent of endeavors, human ingenuity and adaptability remain paramount. It underscores that leadership, true leadership, isn't just about giving orders. It's about understanding the subtle currents of human nature and navigating them with purpose, even when those currents threaten to capsize the entire operation. So, while history records the grand battles, it's in these unsung skirmishes that we truly grasp the nuanced art of command. What we've seen is a mere flash of the strategic brilliance and unwavering resolve that defined General George S. Patton, a man of formidable will who understood that leadership isn't always about overwhelming force, but often about outmaneuvering obstacles not with bullets, but with sheer, unyielding audacity.
This incident with the French mayor, though small in the grand tapestry of the Second World War, illuminates the complex ballet of power, persuasion, and principled stubbornness that characterized command at its highest levels. It reminds us that history is not just made on the grand battlefields, but also in the quiet, tense standoffs, in the moments where human will collides with human will, and the future hangs not on the might of armies, but on the force of a single personality. Patton, a figure often misunderstood and caricatured, emerges here not just as a fiery general, but as a master psychologist, a strategic thinker who could bend situations to his will through pure force of personality and an acute understanding of human nature. This wasn't just about moving tanks. It was about asserting authority, protecting morale, and, most critically, maintaining the precious momentum of a rapidly advancing army.
Every delay, every roadblock, no matter how minor, could have cascading effects, slowing the liberation of Europe and costing countless lives. In this light, Patton's seemingly abrupt action was not a display of arrogance, but a calculated decision rooted in a profound sense of responsibility for the thousands of young men under his command and the millions waiting for freedom. It highlights the brutal efficiency and sometimes uncomfortable pragmatism required of war leaders. They operate in a world where sentimentality is a luxury and decisiveness is paramount. Patton didn't have the time for protracted negotiations or diplomatic niceties. The war machine, once set in motion, demanded uninterrupted progress. His actions, while perhaps jarring to modern sensibilities, were a testament to the iron will necessary to prosecute a war of such immense scale and stakes.
This incident, while perhaps less dramatic than a major tank battle, offers a deeper, more intimate look into the kind of character and leadership required to navigate the treacherous waters of total war. It's a testament to the idea that even the most seemingly insignificant encounters can reveal profound truths about human leadership and the nature of conflict itself. This brief glimpse into Patton's operational philosophy reminds us that the stories of war are rich with such nuanced moments. They are not merely chronicles of combat, but intricate tapestries woven with human ambition, fear, courage, and ingenuity. And it is in these tales, often relegated to footnotes, that we find the true essence of history, the lived experiences that shaped the world we inhabit today. These are the narratives that challenge our preconceived notions and force us to look beyond the headlines into the hearts and minds of those who lived through these extraordinary times.
We uncover stories like this because understanding history isn't just about knowing dates and names. It's about comprehending the forces that drive humanity, the decisions made under immense pressure, and the indelible marks left on the world by extraordinary individuals. It's about learning from the past, not just to avoid repeating mistakes, but to appreciate the incredible complexity and resilience of the human spirit. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next untold story from the crucible of history. Join our community as we continue to uncover the moments that shaped our world. And what of the broader context of Patton's relentless advance? We often focus on the dramatic confrontations, the direct challenges to his authority. But beneath these sharp edges lay the consistent pressure of a war that demanded unwavering speed. The very oxygen of his Third Army was momentum, and any interruption, no matter how seemingly insignificant, was a threat to the strategic objective. This wasn't merely about getting from point A to point B. It was about collapsing the enemy's will to fight, denying them time to regroup, denying them the psychological comfort of holding ground. Consider the landscape through which Patton's tanks roared, the scent of damp earth, the rich, almost cloying perfume of French wildflowers, and beneath it all, the acrid tang of gunpowder, a constant reminder of the war's grim reality. The rumble of Shermans vibrating through the cobbled streets, shaking ancient buildings, a sound that was both terror and liberation for the local populace. The visual tableau was one of stark contrasts. The orderly, disciplined lines of American G1s against the backdrop of war-torn villages, their medieval architecture scarred by modern conflict.
This incident with the mayor, though a brief interlude, encapsulates Patton's operational genius and his profound understanding of human nature. He knew that open defiance, especially from a local authority figure, could fester, becoming a precedent for further obstruction. In wartime, such symbolic acts carried disproportionate weight. A mayor's refusal, however small, could be misinterpreted by the populace as Allied weakness or indecision, a crack in the facade of the unstoppable American advance. This is why his response, while theatrical, was also deeply pragmatic. It wasn't just about moving his tanks, it was about reasserting dominance, about ensuring that the message was clear. The American juggernaut would not be slowed by bureaucratic red tape or local dissent. Let's delve deeper into the psychological warfare inherent in Patton's methods. His carefully cultivated image, the pearl-handled revolvers, the stern gaze, the dramatic speeches, was not merely for show.
It was a projection of power, a psychological weapon wielded with as much precision as any cannon. When he confronted the mayor, his very presence, radiating an almost palpable intensity, was designed to overwhelm. The implicit threat, not of violence against the mayor personally, but of the unstoppable force of war itself, was abundantly clear. It was a masterful demonstration of coercive diplomacy, executed under the most challenging of circumstances. Think about the sheer scale of the logistical challenge. Thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of men, moving through a foreign land, often on roads not designed for such heavy traffic. Fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts. The arteries of supply had to flow continuously. A blocked road, even for a short time, could create a bottleneck, a choke point that would ripple through the entire supply chain, delaying not just a single battalion, but potentially an entire corps. Patton understood this intimately. He was a master of logistics, recognizing that wars are often won or lost on the efficiency of their supply lines. His famously aggressive movements pushed these lines to their absolute breaking point, demanding constant innovation and ruthless efficiency from his quartermasters and engineers. Consider another instance, miles away, yet intrinsically linked by Patton's philosophy. During the advance through Sicily, facing similarly stubborn resistance from local officials or German pockets refusing to yield easily, Patton was known to personally drive to the front lines, often under fire, to assess the situation himself. He wasn't content to merely receive reports. He demanded to see the ground, to feel the pulse of the battle. This direct involvement, whether negotiating with a mayor or rousing flagging troops, was a hallmark of his leadership, a belief that the commander must imbue the entire force with his will and purpose. The sight of the general, often in his distinctive helmet and polished boots, was a powerful motivator, a symbol of unwavering determination that percolated down through the ranks. The French landscape at this time was a mosaic of emotions. Relief at liberation mingled with the stark terror of proximity to the fighting. Joy at seeing Allied uniforms often coexisted with the profound grief for lost loved ones, for destroyed homes, for years of occupation. Within this complex emotional tapestry, mayors were often caught between a rock and a hard place. They were the appointed representatives of their communities, tasked with protecting their people and their towns, even as the storm of war raged around them. The mayor's defiance, while perhaps misguided from a military perspective, can also be viewed through the lens of a desperate attempt to exert some measure of control in a world spinning wildly out of control.
It was a plea for civic order amidst the chaos, a faint echo of peacetime regulations in the roar of combat. Patton's understanding of this complex human element, despite his reputation for ruthlessness, was surprisingly acute. While he demanded obedience and unflinching progress, he was rarely needlessly cruel. His severity was almost always utilitarian, serving a clear military objective. He knew that winning the war also meant winning the peace, and that required, at some level, the cooperation and eventual goodwill of the liberated populations. His theatrics were designed to shock, to intimidate, but ultimately to ensure compliance without resorting to unnecessary brutalities against civilian populations. This delicate balance between intimidation and pragmatism was a tightrope he walked with remarkable skill. The very air in those occupied, then liberated towns was thick with change, with uncertainty, and with the weight of history unfolding. The taste of dust, the smell of wood smoke from makeshift campfires, the distant thud of artillery fire. These were the sensory inputs that defined the experience of war on the ground. And in the midst of this, a man like Patton, a force of nature, navigated not just battlefields, but psychological landscapes, steering a titanic military machine through a continent in turmoil. His genius lay not just in strategic planning, but in his visceral understanding of men, both friend and foe, and his ability to leverage that understanding to achieve his objectives. Consider the echoes of such a confrontation in other theatres, or even in later conflicts. The need for military operations to proceed swiftly, often encountering civilian obstacles, is a recurring theme in warfare. However, few commanders possessed Patton's unique blend of tactical brilliance, psychological insight, and sheer force of personality to handle such situations with such memorable flourish. His methods, though sometimes controversial, were undeniably effective in maintaining the relentless pace he deemed essential for victory. This isn't just about a stubborn mayor and an even more stubborn general. It's about the clash of priorities, the friction between military necessity and civilian life, a constant tension in any war. It's about how supreme commanders must, in real time, assess not just the enemy's positions, but the human terrain, the political sensitivities, the historical context of the land they are fighting over. Patton's reaction, swift and decisive, was not just about clearing a road. It was about laying down a marker, establishing an unshakable precedent for future interactions with local authorities. He was communicating in no uncertain terms that the war effort superseded all other considerations, and that any attempt to impede it would be met with an overwhelming display of military will. This was the essence of his command, a philosophy forged in the crucible of battle, tested and proven under the direst of circumstances. The roar of his engines, the glint of his pistols, and the piercing intensity of his gaze were all part of a finely tuned instrument of war designed to compel cooperation and crush resistance. His legacy is one intertwined with action, with momentum, and with an unwavering belief in the power of a relentless offensive.